All right, here we go. 13.1 to 13.2. We're going to be talking about urbanization of areas and how we're trying to make that more sustainable and planning for the future and so on. The central case study I really liked. It was basically about how Portland in the 70s, like the early 70s, kind of forecasted what was going to be happening. And so the Oregon governor created this thing called the urban growth barrier, which people loved, people hated. It was kind of a real mixed beat. But basically, what was happening is that certain areas can grow commercially and industrial wise, and they could create housing developments and big apartment buildings and whatnot. But certain areas couldn't because they were wanting to protect the farmland and protect the rural areas. It's a really interesting read, actually, and it kind of went under some fire early on, or into the 2000s, stuff like that. They did a really good job of. So honestly, this is honestly, Portland is a really good example of doing urbanization and sprawl and kind of controlling it really well. And Portland's weird, and definitely keeping Portland weird. So first thing I got here, we're on page 332. Is talking about urbanization, and that is basically people moving from the countryside to cities. And this is driven by industrialization, which is the second thing I wrote there. So industrialization is like making technology better so you don't need to live by the farm in order to survive. Think if you live in, downtown Seattle. You're miles and miles and miles and miles and miles away from a farm, but you can still get fresh produce. It's the same thing here in University Place. Our farms are obviously closer than downtown Seattle, but we still don't need to drive on a daily basis to get that stuff. We can go to Safeway, we can go to Albertsons. We'll be okay. That's why we can live in this urban area. So now on 333, so urbanization rates are higher in developing nations. So you can think of basically in developing nations, the cities are becoming more and more popular. So the rates of people moving to the city is becoming greater. And like we saw in the movie, basically their ability to live on the farm and sustain themselves as a farmer is going away. So the opportunity they see is in the city. Next thing I wrote is location, location, location. That is a big phrase in the real estate world because where your house is or where your place of business is, that kind of is determined by its location. Or excuse me, the value of it is determined by its location. So cities are built based on that location, location, location. They're built on trading routes or the desire for better weather. Seattle was built as a trading port in the Puget Sound. Los Angeles, same thing. That's why it's such a huge city. Las Vegas, obviously that was it's in the middle of a desert, but it was on a trading route. That was a stop for where the trains came through. That's where that city started. Better weather, think of Florida. When people retire, people especially from around here, when they retire, they don't want to deal with the grayness and the gloom and the cold and the rain. They want good weather. They want the warmth. They want the sunshine. That's what that stuff's talking about. So the increase in Florida's residents has increased a lot because of that better weather. Moving to 334. So going from cities to suburbs. So you're basically going from downtown and you're starting to move out a little bit. So deteriorating city conditions push people to move out. So if you have too many people crammed into a small area, eventually everybody's like, you know what, I want a yard. I want space for my kids to run around and stuff like that. So now people are moving to things called the exurbs, or regions beyond the suburbs. So it used to be that the city was the hub of all the commercial activity. So if you lived in the suburbs, you would simply commute. You lived in a federal way, but you still had to drive to Seattle. Now the exurbs basically there are jobs and there's more economic and commercial activity in the suburbs. So now you can live outside the suburbs and commute into them. That's what that stuff's talking about there. Another thing we're going to talk about is a thing called urban sprawl. So this is the spread of low density development from an urban center. So basically you can think of it as like downtown per se. Downtown is growing. And land sprawl typically grows faster than population growth because as people move farther away from the city, there's more land that's cheaper, so I'm going to buy it. to build my house with the big yard. And then the next people are going to buy even a bigger house with a bigger yard, and so on, so on, so on. So the land sprawl, or the area taken up by people, is going to grow faster than the population growth. So for example, here's Las Vegas. You can see 1986 to 2013, so almost 30 years. You can see the huge, how small it is there compared to what it is now. That's the big thing. So like the Las Vegas Strip, just FYI, is like right along in here. That's what that is. That's the airport. I lived over here. I taught over there, just FYI. All right, so page 335, sprawl is motivated by wanting more and by wanting convenience. So you want more space. So like I was just saying, like I have a little kid, I want a yard for him to run around in. That's the big thing. You want more space. Like I don't want to be crammed in a tiny apartment building with a family. I want space for them to get out and to be able to burn their energy and learn to ride their bikes and stuff like that. Okay, more affluent community. So if you are starting to make money in the city, well, now I don't want a little apartment. I have more money. I want a big house. Okay, you also want less traffic. So like if you live in downtown Seattle and you're trying to drive your car around, there's always traffic, no matter what time of the day or night. There's always traffic. I have a cousin in New York. He doesn't have a car. He hasn't had a car in like, how long has he been there now? 8 years? The only time he drives is when he comes back to Washington for Christmas. And side note, now he's a terrible driver because of it. So basically he wants to get away from the traffic. So he doesn't even have a car. All right, so now we're moving to 336. So obviously there's some drawbacks to sprawl. So transportation obviously becomes a really, really, really big problem because everything, if you're trying to get away from downtown, but you still need to work in downtown, you got to drive your car. And that's a bad thing, obviously, because it's basically creating more pollution. So instead of me having to drive 5 miles to work, now I got to drive 25 miles to work. Pollution also basically occurs more because the pollution is not only kind of concentrated in one area, but now there's more pollution from more land. The health, driving instead of walking. So basically I'm sitting rather than walking, the 2 miles or whatever it is. Like my cousin, he's in great health because he walks everywhere, takes a subway everywhere. So he's walking 2 or 3 miles a day just on his normal commute now. Land use, there's no interaction with nature, and that's a big thing. My cousin in New York, his little girl, who's almost 3, has literally seen a tree 3 times. And that was the 3 times they came back to Washington. Even though they're really close to Central Park, for whatever reason, they never go there. I don't know why, but they never do. The economics, there's growth over maintenance. And that is where the deterioration of downtown urban centers occurs. Because the money is spent more on growing the city and expanding the city rather than taking care of what has already been built. City planning, big, big, big thing to do. Okay? They got to make sure that they are proactive about it rather than reactive. So these guys are the guys that are going to be studying those demographic charts that we talked about, those age structure diagrams, to see what's going and to forecast that, okay, I think we're going to have 10 million more people across the next 20 years, so we better prepare for it. Okay, they do street layouts. That's a real big thing to make sure traffic flows smoothly. The building height is a big deal as well. Transportation needs, so if they need to, do new subways or new bus routes, things like that. Okay, these Washington planning, okay, this is a really good example of this. So they planned this whole thing out for Washington, D.C. in 1791. And you can see the Washington, D.C. today right there. It's actually really similar. They did a really good job of following along with that plan. Regional planning, this is going to be a much bigger area. So think of regions as like, multiple counties are all working together to do this. And so more municipalities, that's going to basically make it so that way more of the areas work together. So University Place is going to work with Fircrest, which is going to work with Tacoma, which is going to work with Lacey, and so on. Like, you got to get a whole bunch of different organizations together so you can plan out a bigger area together. 338, we're talking about zoning. This is going into that city planning thing. So the city planners create zones. zones for specific areas like industrial area versus commercial area versus residential area. And this urban growth boundary, that's what I was talking about in the beginning with what Portland does. So this protects the rural areas for being overrun by the city. So if the city is expanding and expanding and expanding, it's not just going to take it over. So a great picture of this is Portland here. Okay, you can see inside the UGB, that urban growth boundary, there's a ton of big buildings and commercialization and high-rise apartment buildings and so on. But outside of it, it's farmland. They protected it really well. So they're not just like farming or just like paving over everything. They're keeping them separate from each other. So Portland, Oregon and the municipalities around it did a really good job of that. All right, here's a term here I love to say, gentrification. Gentrification is transforming the conditions to cater to wealthier people. I just like that phrase. So you can think of like when I grew up, Tacoma was pretty run down. You know, they always used to joke about the Tacoma aroma because it was a very industrial city. It was kind of run down. But Tacoma went through the process of gentrification. Or if you think about Ruston Way was a really, really toxic area. They used to do a lot of shipping of toxic chemicals and waste out of that kind of stuff. So the Ruston Way was really, really, really deteriorated. But they put a lot of money into it, and now Ruston Way is great. I love that place. You know, we went and my birthday, when was that, last year? 2 years ago? Something like that. No, it was my wife's birthday. We went down and rented those little Lime scooters and ran around. It was a great little area. So they also do a thing called smart growth, meaning that you're going to build up, not out. So you're going to build taller buildings rather than expanding out with a whole bunch of houses. New urbanization, they also don't need cars. Like I was saying, my cousin in New York, he doesn't have a car. So his life is built around the transit system. It's built around where the subway stations are. So he knows the subway stations like the back of his hand. All right, 340. Giving citizens transportation options is the newest way to relieve traffic. So buses and trains and bikes and light rail and subway. There's a whole bunch of different public transportation options that are cheaper, better for the environment, they're better for your health. Like if you do biking, like Amsterdam, if you ever get a chance to go to Amsterdam, first off, it's beautiful over there. And then second off, if you ever go to like a train station, there's literally hundreds upon hundreds of bikes leaning against each other. And we took a tour over there, and the resident in Amsterdam was saying that basically nobody locks their bikes up because you just simply ride the bike to the train station, you put the bike against the other bikes. When you get back off the train, you just grab a bike and you start riding. And so it was almost like a community bike system. It was really cool to see, actually. Obviously, this whole thing has to be planned out ahead of time. All right, so now we're just going to skip a page. We're going to go to 342. So parks, greenways, green belts, they're all ways of city managed to keep nature in the city. That we think there's a problem called a nature deficit disorder. Meaning if you don't get out and you don't see the trees and you don't experience nature and see the squirrels and the birds and whatnot, you're not going to appreciate it. So cities are trying to do a little bit more of that by putting green into their cities. You know, so people have a place to go walk their dog and play with their kids and just kind of get out and be healthy. They also need a thing called green buildings to help minimize our ecological footprint. And these green buildings, this picture here on 343, has a ton of different things about a green building. You can do everything from landscaping with native plants. You do raised garden, like a raised garden bed, so it reduces runoff. You can talk about the low E windows, basically meaning what that is insulation. So like even your windows, it's not going to be an easy place for heat to escape your house. You know, another one is this radiant heating and cooling system. So basically they're using, the heat or they're kind of holding on to the heat for later times. You can see you got photos, you got the solar cells on top, you got natural lighting. This is just like the epitome of a green building. Okay, there's also an organization called the LEED system. It's called you get like a LEED certification for your buildings. It's called the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Basically, LEED certified means that you are doing a whole bunch to make sure that your building is ecologically friendly or energy efficient or it's sustainable, things like that. That's what they talk about with the LEED certified buildings, which they're getting more and more of in Seattle actually, because we're in a very progressive state, luckily. All right, so this is urban sustainability here. That's kind of our next little bit we're going to be talking about later on. And so leave me questions.